get started here in just about a minute or so. If you guys are just coming in, whether you're on Facebook or Zoom or whatever, we've got a few people who are lining up, greased and ready for action. Very good. Well, as they say in the showbiz world, it's time to get this road on the show. Welcome, everybody, to Brainstorming the Human Connection, a production of the South Dakota Humanities Council. And today our guest is Hannah Haksgaard. And Hannah has a very unique research project that she's been working on. But it's important for you to know that Hannah isn't just sort of your general hoi polloi, you know. She's a professor at the USD and in the law school over there. And she's been working on, I think, one of the more interesting projects that I've heard about in the law school in some time. And she's going to tell you about that. And then we're going to have a discussion about how pioneer women have impacted South Dakota in general and us more specifically today. So I think that's going to be a very interesting topic. And I'm hoping that as you listen, that you will have ideas, things that come to mind, things that we can share, questions that you have about her very interesting research. So with that short introduction, welcome, Hannah. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. I should mention to everybody too that there's a reasonable, though hopefully not so likely, chance that I will be flipping in or out or something because of the internet connection. We had kind of a stuttering earlier today, but I'm out in the west part of the state today, so I'm not on my usual internet connection, and I'm not sure about this one, but it seems to be holding up so far. So anyway, Hannah, I'm sorry for that diversion, but getting back to your kind of bio, can you give us a kind of an elevator speech, a 50,000-foot view of who the heck is Hannah anyway?
Yeah, so thank you, Lawrence, for the introduction. And I want to thank Lawrence and the South Dakota Humanities Council for having me here today. I'm really excited to get to talk about this topic in this forum. So I'm Hannah Haksgaard, and I grew up just west of Yankton, and I did my K through 12 education in the Yankton School District. I then got my undergraduate degree from the University of Kentucky and my law degree from UC Berkeley. After law school, I moved home to Pierre for 1 year, then Fargo for 3, working for federal judges, and then wound my way back to southeastern South Dakota. I now live in Vermilion and teach at the law school, where I mostly teach classes on family law and property law.
Very nice. Just like an attorney, you know, you're precise, get in there, get the job done, get out. I love that. So I want to really get into your research because I think that that's going to be, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of interesting things you do, but I'm very interested in this research that you did on pioneer, that you're doing actually on pioneer women. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I will preface it with this is when I was in kindergarten, my grandmother, who she was a German-Russian Mennonite from Freeman, she gave me the full set of Laura Ingalls Wilder books. I loved them. I loved them when I was little. I continue to love them. And as I sort of entered adulthood, I just started picking up and reading all the books that I could find on female homesteaders. I realized that there's a lot of really beautiful and well-researched books about female homesteaders in sort of a lot of different contexts. And it's something that in the last 40 years or so, the historians have really done a good job of researching. But as I became law trained and started thinking about the law a lot more, I realized that these women's lives would be really impacted by the federal laws of homesteading. And all of these historians who were doing all of this dense research in archives, reading, right, all these stories and telling all these stories about female homesteaders just weren't talking about the law. And so I thought a bit naively that I would embark on a project to just, well, study the laws that impacted female homesteaders and sort of figure out the relationship between the lived experiences of these women that these historians are doing such a good job telling, and how the law maybe impacted that. So that was sort of the start, right? And I think it's worth, before we get any deeper in, is kind of saying that, of course, whenever we talk about homesteading, whether it's the legal portion or just sort of the fact of the individual people, is we're, of course, studying the dispossession of Indigenous lands, right? So I think it's very appropriate to think about the women we talk about today as playing a role in settler colonialism. But just because, of course, these women were part of dispossessing Indigenous lands does not mean we shouldn't study them. And I, in fact, think the study of them goes hand in hand with the study of sort of federal Indian law. And it goes hand in hand with studying sort of broadly history and how these historical pieces all fit together.
Can you give us some examples of how some laws that impacted women in some particular way, even if they weren't particularly written for women, or were there ones that were written particularly for women?
Yeah, so I will start with the Homestead Act of 1862. The Homestead Act of 1862 says that any person who is the head of household or any person who is the age of 21 can homestead. It did not say any man, it said any person. And that's kind of astounding for a law written in 1862 to encompass both men and women. And so I think that's our starting point. And it's not obvious that that's the way that Congress would go. In fact, Canada had a similar homesteading law, and they limited their law to only men. So if you study women, sort of frontier women north of the Canadian border, they were all married, right? Because they had to come and get a homestead with a husband because only men were qualified. But in the United States, we wrote it in an almost gender neutral way that allowed both men and women to claim homesteads. And I think the fact that Congress in 1862 decided to say any person rather than any man is what opens this whole field up for even thinking about even having this as a topic of conversation, right? Of like, well, what about women homesteaders? Well, it's because Congress decided to include them.
It's very interesting. I think the context in which we have to understand this is like, what were women doing as homesteaders? You know, and I want to get back specifically to the law, but I think it would be useful to build some context. Who were these women? What were they doing? Why did they come? That kind of thing. Can you paint that picture for us?
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing question, right? And I think that the historians have done a great job of answering that question. So when we think about sort of women who homesteaded, there are sort of a number of different categories of women who might have had different legal status under various laws, and their lives might have looked different. So a lot of women came with husbands as a married couple. It's almost really hard to track those women because when the patents were filled out and when the homestead applications were made, the head of household, who is by definition the husband, is the one who filed the paperwork. So it's actually a little hard to track married women, but we of course know from the historical records and how many of those women kept diaries and wrote sort of histories themselves, that there were a whole lot of women who homesteaded with husbands and sort of did what you would imagine of a lot of that taking care of the home, taking care of children as part of the settlement of the West. That's kind of the easier piece. I think the harder piece and the piece that starts to open it up is because Congress allowed unmarried women who were qualified as any person to homestead, that opened it up to other categories of women. So you had widows who homesteaded, you had women who had never been married. So these women came west, and I think that, Lawrence, this is where it's sort of interesting to your question is they had different reasons for coming. So a lot of rather young women came out west and they homesteaded a quarter section right next to their dad or right next to their brother or even right next to their fiance, because if they got title in their own name, they could then transfer it to a male family member, make the family holdings larger. So that's definitely one category of what drove women, single women, to come homestead. There were also women who simply wanted the economic agency that came with owning land. So it was a time investment to come out and get their homestead land, and then they sold off the land, right, which gave them some economic power. Other women held on to it, rented it, and of course, some women just wanted adventure, right? It was just a fun thing to do. And we know that there were small groups of women. Imagine 4 or 6 women who are all friends decide to go west and homestead in a little cluster because it was an adventuresome thing to do at sort of, especially early in life for women who hadn't yet been married.
You know, that brings up a very interesting observation that I've made traveling around like Nebraska, well, not so much Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota, and North Dakota. And every once in a while, I'll run into these operations. One that comes to mind is this rather large building out near the border on Highway 12 of, it's kind of like North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. And there is, did I get that right? Sometimes I flip those, Wyoming and Montana. Montana's on the top, right?
Yeah.
Montana, that's the one. Sometimes my dyslexia kicks in and I get flipped the map. But at any rate, there was this very interesting, rather large restaurant that was built with railroad ties. You know, they had gotten these railroad ties and they had put cement in between the railroad ties and used this railroad ties kind of like as bricks. And they'd use the nails, the rail nails to like place them. Ingenious. And then I found out, because there was a plaque, that it was like some women who built that. And part of the reason is because that's what they had. And it was easier, I think ingenious, but it was easier to like place that without having heavy equipment or a team, so to speak. You know, you didn't have to have a team of horses or something. But at any rate, those things pointed out to me that there were women who were like out here doing things just as beings, but they weren't in the sort of typical family unit, the sort of classical family unit. They were actually doing things. I'm wondering if you have other cases of that, as I'm trying to build the context and background for what we're talking about.
That sounds like a fascinating building and a really cool example. I mean, I don't know that I have anything quite as specific as that, but I would say that we know that a lot of the single women who came out to homestead maybe didn't do the actual farming. So the Homestead Act of 1863 had kind of a 3-step process. So the first thing you did was you filed on a piece of land, and you had to, of course, be qualified to file. Single women were qualified to do so. And then you had to live on the land, depending on the time period until what statute governed, either 3 years or 5 years. And during that period, you had to cultivate the land and you had to build a habitable home while you resided on it. And then at the end, the third step was you actually get title from the government. So I think a lot of our studying, sort of what these women did, is in that kind of 3 to 5 year period where they were required to reside, cultivate, and build a habitable home, right? And so women often did not do the actual tilling of the soil, right? The planting of their own crops. They very often traded labor with male neighbors. And so there's a lot of instances of women homesteaders who they perhaps were teachers. And so they lived on a teacher's salary. And so they paid somebody to come actually cultivate their land. Or women who did things like take in washing, right? So they traded washing or bread making with male neighbors. So they traded some of the labors. And so I do think that women, and especially these single women too, played an important role in kind of building communities in the West. Is, well, they were available to be school teachers, they were available to cook and do laundry and largely support the infrastructure of sort of the Western settlement. And so they did play a lot of unique roles in how the West gets settled. And then as we get more developed and we start getting more small towns, a lot of women were incredibly engaged in sort of general civic engagement, building churches, supporting schools, making community functions happen, right? A lot of that small town life that happened early on was because of the women who showed up to make it happen.
You know, as you're talking about this, one of the things that comes to mind is maybe that inclusion of women and just saying people was not really an accident. Because if you're thinking about moving the country west and actually populating it with your people, you're not going to do that without women, you know. And if you had any experience at all, you know that when you sent the men first, often it was, let's say, a bit challenging to get the women to come out later. So you might want to start off by trying to seed it, so to speak, with a number of women anyway. What would you think of that observation?
Yeah, so that's all right. And I can give a little more detail because that first full winter when we were kind of with lockdown and COVID, I spent actually most of my time sitting right here in this attic reading old statutory history about the Homestead Act of 1862. And one of the links that went in the chat is to actually the paper that was published in the Wayne Law Review. It's available for free download online. It's open access, so it can be easily shared. And what I did was I read 20 years of congressional debates leading up to the passage of the Homestead Act of 1862. And as I was reading, there's a lot of stuff that Congress talks about. There's a lot of issues of states' rights, of is slavery going to end, right, as we start expanding? I mean, this is all wrapped up in the politics, immigration reform. All of this is like really critically important to how the Homestead Act gets negotiated. But one of the side issues that's kind of percolates throughout is how are we going to treat women? And I started reading the statutory code in 1843 so I could have 20 full years of debate. And slowly over time, Congress came to an agreement that they would say any person rather than any man. And there were a couple of times during this process that a senator or representative actually made an equality type argument, right? If you're gonna let the single men homestead, you should let the single women. Because there were some congressional members who thought only families should go, right? It should only be married couples and kids because those are the kinds of people we want out settling the West. At the point they decided to include single men, then there was an equality argument of like, well, if you're going to include single women or single men, you need to include single women. But even that, the undertone of it was always, we need women on the frontier. And so a lot of the debate of like, well, why does Congress want to give land to women, which again, it's 1862, right? It's kind of amazing that Congress is saying, hey, women, you can just have a piece of land in your own name that the federal government is going to give to you that you own. Well,
They couldn't
Congress
have a bank
got,
account, but they couldn't have a bank account, but they could have land.
right. Yeah, I mean, but it's all about, Lawrence, what you're suggesting is Congress understands that this will incentivize some women to go. And if it incentivizes some women to go, those women will marry, those women will have babies, and it will populate the American West. So there's also, I mean, I will say this too, is as I was reading through, I counted 5 instances where one congressman or a senator kind of stands up and makes a speech that says, you should include women. And the official congressional record has a bracket in there that says laughter. Right.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, and so it was a joke for much of this, right? It's like, I can't believe we'd even talk about giving these women land. But then we decide to do it because Congress ultimately really does think that women will go out there, get married, have babies. It's going to keep us as a stable population.
Yeah, that's poignant what you say, because I think there's some kind of proverb that says, first they laugh, then they claim it's their idea.
It's certainly true in this instance.
So let's talk a little bit about the personhood, because one of the things that comes to mind is that at the same time, I believe that if you were European, that didn't apply to you. So how did they get past that? How did they get past the Homestead Act? It didn't apply. It only applied to Europeans, but then they said, well, it's for persons. Or they're saying, well, these aren't really people. What was up with that? How did they get around that?
Yeah, so throughout this debate, there was a lot of discussion of race, right? So a number of, like very unsurprisingly, right? Like a number of senators and representatives propose at various times that we should say any white person or any white head of family. And it wasn't just sort of a black-white issue, it was also an immigration issue. And so there was also claims of, right, any sort of American citizen, anyone who resides in America at the time of passage, all of these things are debated. So by the time it gets passed, I mean, this is really, I guess to back up slightly, it's the Homestead Act of 1862. There's a pretty obvious reason that it does not pass until the South secedes. So the Southern politicians don't want this law to pass because it will lead to more population in the West, more states. Those states are going to likely be free states, which is going to sort of hamper their ability to keep slavery. So the Homestead Act ends up actually being passed race neutral. And so from the very moment it was passed, African Americans are allowed to homestead, and they don't do it in great numbers, but it definitely happens. And this is one of those things historians have studied. And I know this is not sort of my area of expertise, but like I know there's a community in Kansas where there was just a whole lot of African Americans who homesteaded right in the same location. But again, like just the fact that women were included is sort of blows your mind a little bit because of the time frame. It also, the fact that it was race neutral, in that it did not specify only white people, is pretty amazing too. Now, it does specify that you had to be a citizen or on a path to citizenship. So new immigrants who came in could take, I mean, they could take up the federal government on this offer, but they had to be on the path to citizenship in order to get their final title. Now, who this very obviously excludes is, of course, all of our Native American population, because they were not citizens at the time that this law is passed, and we don't treat the 14th Amendment as creating citizenship for them. So really the one group that's truly excluded is the Native American population.
That's a very interesting observation. And I think, they didn't have very many Asians at that time, but they did have some. I'm not sure how, sometimes there's a law on the books and there's sometimes a law in practice. You know what I mean? It's like, well, for example, we have codes of conduct for police, but we also know that they don't always follow it, so there's a law and then there's the practice law. So I'm just wondering, how did that impact women in terms of like, okay, it isn't gender specific. It does include women as far as like, it doesn't write them out of it, but how did it happen? What happened in practice?
Yeah, let me actually, Laura sent in a chat that makes me realize I need to make one more point about kind of the prior answer is the other thing that Congress decided to exclude was anyone who had taken up arms against the United States. So they excluded all Confederate soldiers. So all Confederates were excluded because you were not allowed to get a homestead if you'd taken up arms against the United States. So again, it's passed after the South secedes, right? But I do think Laura's point that it was super important for like Union soldiers and also the widows on both sides. So as long as you weren't a Confederate soldier, you were qualified. So in terms of this question of, okay, so the law is written gender neutral, but what does that really mean for women? I have never found an account of, at any level of government, someone just saying like, I'm not in the mood to give you your homestead claim or your fee simple simply because you're a woman. Really early on, there's an administrative law case where it came up of, well, are women any person? And the federal agency who was in charge, so the land department, they said really early on that women are any person, and so they're qualified. And once they gave that directive, then all of their staff offices throughout the country, as far as I know, followed that directive and gave title and let women claim their homesteads. And I don't know of any real issue with that.
So did you see any cases where there was like any public backlash, to that idea?
Well, I don't know if there's public backlash to the idea of women generally being able to claim land. I think it's unsurprising that there's, of course, going to be claims that, well, if women are taking land, then it's not available for men. So it's not available for men to use to support their family. Women consistently made up a little bit more than 10% of the homesteaders. So these cries of, well, there's not enough land available for the men, they didn't ever become really widespread. I think that's always percolating a little bit, right? But there just tended to be enough land available. Now, I will, excuse me, I will transition to talk about a very specific category of women where I do think we see a little bit of contesting whether or not they were going to be treated as people who are qualified to homestead. And that is deserted wives. So I mentioned earlier, right, these categories of widows, divorced women, never married women. It's obvious that those are single women they can homestead. There was one category of women that from the start, there was a lot of confusion about. And that was women who had been deserted by their husbands, but weren't actually divorced. So the factual scenario we're talking about here is, imagine husband and wife head out west, they claim a homestead together, right? Husband files on it. And then at some point during that sort of 5-year period, husband walks away from his wife, walks away from his homestead, and the woman is left there on the homestead, but she doesn't have title to it yet, right? Because he hasn't finished this 3-step process. So then the question is, well, is this woman qualified as any person to homestead? And initially, the argument was no, she doesn't qualify because she's a wife, and so her legal identity is wrapped up in that of her husband. Only her husband has the right to homestead. And this was the rule for a little while. And then ultimately the land department came in and reversed it and said, no, a deserted wife becomes qualified to homestead under the Homestead Act. But that's one that it took a little while to get to, right? So there was initially pushback for it. And then there's later a lot of litigation. And so in the other link that got shared earlier is a whole article about deserted wives, which is the one in the Nebraska Law Review. Again, totally free to download, share. It's open access, so there's no issues with broadly sharing it. I read a whole bunch of administrative law decisions that contemplated whether a deserted wife could get title to the homestead. And these were often very fact-intensive inquiries because the administrative law judge basically had to ask, has this woman been so deserted that she's essentially a single woman now? Like, why did the husband leave? How long has he been gone? Has he been sending money back? Has he been doing anything to support his wife? Right? If he is just fully deserted, then she has the right to homestead and take over. So Lawrence, is kind of looping now back finally to your question about sort of competing claims. Is a lot of these cases that I read on deserted wives, it actually would become like husband's gone, right? He's out of here. He's not coming back. It would become a fight between the wife on one hand and a neighbor on the other, or somebody else who wanted to claim that homestead. And so the wife on one hand, she'd be saying, look, husband's gone. He hasn't sent money. It's not my fault. He's the bad guy. He walked away. On the other hand, the sort of neighbor, the person who wanted to make the new claim would be like, yeah, she's not really deserted. Husband didn't really leave. Like, don't let her have the property rights because I want them. And so a lot of the cases that actually get litigated and we have written decisions about do pit sort of a deserted wife against somebody else who's trying to claim that land.
Interesting. I want to get back to some other points, very brilliant points that you made. I want to, however, open this up to our esteemed panel. Do you guys have any questions, comments, experiences that you can add to our conversation? This is a conversation program. Anybody? Just unmute yourself and start talking. Anybody? Going once? Sharon?
When you said esteemed panel, I'm wondering if there's a panel in the background that I
No, you're one of the esteemed panel. all the people on this call are the esteemed panel.
That was a quick ascension. Well, this is really interesting, and Lawrence, you're a great moderator, and I really appreciate the theme. But a couple of nights ago, I was at a poetry reading, and one of the readers was Athena Kildegard. She teaches at the University of Minnesota Morris, so she's out there on the prairie. And she took this whole book of hers, Prairie Midden, is about prairie women who homesteaded. Whether I think most of these poems that I've read, the women in these cases have been married, but she has also done a lot of research, and she has a lot of found poems. And if you don't mind, I'll read a very short found poem that might throw light on some of the one woman. This is December 7th, 1894. Dear Sir, enclosed, please find report of death, a child of Mr. and Mrs. John C. Thresh machine on place, run over by tank man. The boy died after 3 weeks, or on the 16th of November. But Mr. C has not buried his boy yet. Now, doctor, would you please inform me whether the Board of Health can act in this matter and how to go on? Truly yours, William G., Town Clerk. That's kind of a neighbor versus neighbor, but over a very sad subject.
Yes, very sad.
Sharon, could you repeat the name of that book and the author? Some people weren't able to hear you.
Okay, Prairie Midden, Midden, which means a dung pile. But it's got a lot of stuff thrown into this midden. And the author is Athena Kildegard. I always want to say Kierkegaard, but it's Kildegard. Kildegaard.
And thank you for introducing that word mitten to my vocabulary. I can now
Midden.
have an M-I-T-T?
No, Midden. Midden.
Yeah, midden. Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. But now I have an official name for what to call my books now. I can,
Yeah, mine too. Throw another one into the midden.
Anyone else have thank you very much, Sharon. Anyone else have some insight or something you can add to our conversation? Questions?
I have a question, if I may.
Go ahead, Lee.
I'm talking about in the 50s. My father was killed at relatively younger age. And when it was time for the land to be divided after his death, the wife was not considered the owner. So she was considered as a descendant, just like the children. And would you say that's because they did not really do a lot of wills or trusts at that time? Because her name definitely was not on the deed. Was that a typical case?
Yeah, so Lee, was this in South Dakota?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a variety of different states and how they treat property at the death of one's spouse. But especially in the 1950s, if only kind of the husband's name had been on the deed, then unless he has a will that specifically says it goes to his wife, then what you described as accurate is a portion would go to the wife and a portion would go to the children. Now there's been sort of monumental shifts in the last 200 years on how we've dealt with property like this. I mean, the short answer is always write a will if you can, and sort of a slightly longer answer is if you're married, co-own property. There's a variety of ways to do that. But Lee, what you described is exactly what I would expect to happen if only the husband's name was on the title.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Well, while people are thinking, to keep this, keep our motion going, and please do keep thinking and formulating questions or comments. Or Sharon, you're going to say something? You'll have to unmute though.
Okay.
There you go.
I don't want to take too much time. Well, then hurry up and say what you want to say, Sharon. Get off. I'm just so proud of you, Hannah, because you have a German from Russia background. So do I. And you're so intelligent.
Oh, thank you.
Are you saying that's unusual?
You're so learned, if that's the word, not intelligent. There are a lot of intelligent Germans from Russia, but they just got education. My father being one of them, having a third grade education, but he wasn't stupid. He was just, his father just needed him to work on the farm. Anyway, though, I'm just so proud of you, even though I don't know you, because you are such an excellent speaker. And I just love it that you were up there in the attic reading this book. I'm a report on all of this. stuff.
Well, thank you, Sharon. I appreciate that. And I think that my grandmother would very much appreciate that if she were alive to hear it too.
Well, I'm happy to see that you've transitioned from ivory tower to Eddie. You know, I think that's
Yes.
that's a promotion. Well, okay. So I have a question that's
It
kind of
does
a
look like
sub-
Laura's hand is up. I don't know if you can
Oh,
see.
I didn't see that. Laura, oh, I'm
Hello.
sorry. Go ahead, Laura. I didn't see
Hello,
that.
I'm in my
Oh.
car, so I apologize for not being live with video because I'm driving to an appointment. But, you know, I had a thought, or I would like you to comment on the impact of the media in that day and age on the women's willingness to go west. Because, you know, it's a kind of a then to now type of idea. And I just want to know what your thoughts maybe are on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because it's the historians of advertising have done a lot of beautiful work on collecting all these kind of print advertisements that were promoting homesteading, right? Come out to the land of
Yeah.
plenty, all of this stuff. There was certainly some of that's targeted at women. And the other thing that really happens, I mean, I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm always thinking about the law, is states made seemingly very strategic decisions to make the law favorable to women. And so perhaps not advertising or print media, but of course, once you pass a law that's favorable to women, you try to get that story run in all the Eastern papers. So this actually relates a lot to what Lee says. So a number of Western states at this time period start adopting what we would call community property types of marital property regimes. And those community property states like California, for example, Nevada, they advertise this as being really really good for women. And Lee's hypothetical, like if that happens in California, you know, the wife then gets the land in the sense that she already owns half of it. And so the one way that states kind of did try, and territories, then states tried to attract women, was to pass more friendly marital property regimes that let women have more power over property. They were some of the first states to let women vote, right? There's some themes that definitely develop throughout of, well, if we make life a little bit better for women, they will come here. And so it's advertising, it's doing print media. I mean, the book by Pruitt, that's sort of the single woman homesteader book, right, that she kind of publishes and makes a splash in the East. There's a lot of stuff going on that's trying to encourage women to take part in homesteading and move west.
You know, that really brings up a very interesting observation that women on the prairie seem to have attained political stature quicker than people in other parts of the country, particularly in the East, where they were still arguing about it. They were giving women the right to vote out here on the prairie. And I'm wondering if that whole transition of being the, let's say, the vanguard and the palpable necessity of women for civilization maybe felt more palpable to people out on the prairie as opposed to people who stayed on the East Coast directly still in the mindset of Europe, basically, where women were kind of like chattel, you know. Can you speak to whether that is accurate or not?
I think it is, right? I think that women were certainly given more rights faster in a lot of these Western states with low populations, right? Especially Western states where a lot of men were moving because there's a lot of railroad work, or there was a lot of farm laboring work, right? Or there are a lot of homesteads to be claimed. There was this drive to incentivize women to come. Now, that only went so far, right? I mean, well, why were these women valued? Well, because they would engage in reproduction, both in the sense of they would reproduce those European, like those like those Euro-American, maybe I should say, communities, right? They make those small towns. They make sure Christianity had a presence because there would be churches, right? They would also, of course, give birth, right? And they would have lots of babies. And there is a lot of really good stuff in the minds of kind of the settlers that women brought. Now, that only goes so far, right? It's not like there's a safe haven out in the West where women have all of their rights. Like, no, I mean, it takes a really long time for women to get equal rights. But I do think it's part of our culture, right? Is like, we, at least I think in South Dakota, think of women as relatively independent thinkers. And although proportionally, not a lot of them farm compared to men, right? Like, we have women who play really important roles in agriculture, and all of that stuff I think is really continued.
Well, one of the things I've observed in pictures more than in actual text, when I see either photographs or paintings, the thing that has struck me a lot about the women in those pictures is how hard they look and how much like men they look. When you look at like their hands and their faces, you can see that, they did not lead an easy life. They were not the pristine sitting up with the lace and, petticoats and stuff like that. They might have had them, but you didn't see that that was their life. You look at the hands that were even painted, which means that somebody really paid attention to that. And you can see like the tone of the skin is like, that's a person who's handled an axe. They know what chopping wood is. It's not something that's esoteric. And I did it one time to say, hey, look at me, I can chop wood too. That was something you did every day.
Yeah, they worked hard. And there are also certain dangers, right? I have a book on my shelf that I will sort of share the name of. It's a brand new release called Birthing the West. And it's by Jennifer Hill. And this book, it's a great book about sort of birth and midwives on the frontier. I just finished reading it, but I think that she makes some compelling points that actually relate pretty closely to Sharon's poem that she read earlier, of just the dangers of childbirth and how many women lost infant and young children on the frontier, right? It was not an easy life, either in terms of the physical labor they were doing or in terms of their reproductive capacities. Right, and I think, they worked hard for sure.
Well, I think, this brings up, the whole sort of men versus women thing, these kinds of insights and parsing it out, as far as like how the law impacted people. It brings to mind how we come forward. What happened then legally, and thus in everyday life in some cases. What were some things that you found that morphed over into how we view women today, what women's roles are today? Have you seen any kind of breadcrumbs?
Yeah, I would say that, well, let me answer this in two parts, right? I think that there was, not answering it as today question, but the way back in the 1860s, is after the Homestead Act of 1862 allows women to homestead, it was a sea change, because we'd had a lot of land grant laws before, had a lot of land grant laws after. The Homestead Act's the most famous one, but after they decided to make women qualified for the Homestead Act, then all of the acts that followed also encompassed women. And that's really interesting, right? As they made the change here, the acts before had said men. It had been about men and men, right? Now it's about, or sometimes widows, right? Sometimes widows had separate status, but never just unmarried women. So there was a change in the sense that all of the laws that came after followed this pattern, included unmarried women. So that set the stage for federal land policy, federal land department policy, that women would be landowners as well. Now, I don't think that that is translated into women being farmers that's like sort of on equal footing with men, right? Like if you think about a lot of the stuff that goes into ag, is it's very family structured. And we just know that even today, when we think of there being like a lot of sort of gender parity, right? And like not that much gender discrimination compared to where we came from, is it's almost always sons who are still inheriting farms from their parents. And that's true even today. And so, I mean, I think that's a place where, sure, the federal government doesn't discriminate based on sex. Sure, there's nothing that stops a woman from being a farmer, but we still might have cultural norms that indicate that, well, farmers' sons are the new farmers, right? Not necessarily farmers' daughters. So I think that, sure, it sets us up for a gender neutral law, but that doesn't necessarily change how we might act in life.
That's the point I was trying to make before, is that, you know, you have the law, and then you have, so there's the intent, and then there's an actual thing that happens, you know. And sometimes the laws are passed by a kind of like slight majority, so everybody's not on board. And the people who weren't on board, they go right away into trying to sabotage it. It's kind of like people pass equal education, and people right away try to figure out ways, well, how do we make it look like that was a dumb idea? So you have, like, you know, substandard books, lead paint on the walls, the teachers who really don't want to be teachers and feel like they were punished for being sent to that school. All of that stuff gets put in. So when I hear that there's a law that allows women to do something that was at least questionable before, the first thing that comes to mind is like, okay, well, but did it happen? You know, and to what extent did it happen?
So actually, this is an instance where I think the outcome of the law was maybe more successful than the people who passed it thought. And perhaps I'm defining success differently than the Congress members and who sat in that chamber in 1862. During the debate over 20 years, there are a lot of guys, and of course they're all men, right? A lot of men who stand up and say, but women aren't going to homestead. Like, it's stupid that we're even arguing about it because these women are not going to go do this, right? They just said, why even bother writing them in? Because what woman in her right mind would take off alone across the prairie, live on a quarter section for 5 years, right? It's not going to happen. And so there's definitely those people. And then, of course, they finally give in. And it's just like, whatever. Well, if women aren't going to do it anyway, then what harm does it cause? Well, it turns out a whole lot more women took advantage of this than anybody thought was going to happen, right? And the other thing that Congress people kept saying is they kept saying, even if a woman goes out and claims this land, she's not going to be successful. There's no way she stays out there for 5 years, right? But it turns out that women are just as like single women are just as successful as the rest of your homesteaders. So depending on the community, right, it changes a little bit, but they're almost always over 10% of any geographic area. The homesteaders are single women, and their rates of getting that fee simple title at the end is just as good as everybody else, which is kind of astounding because you realize that a huge proportion of the men who were homesteading had wives to help them, right? So it was a pair who were doing it, whereas these women were truly single by definition, and yet they were sort of just as successful.
You mentioned earlier, to your point, you mentioned earlier that there were cases where women got together, kind of like to say, well, you know, maybe I don't want to be even lonely out there by myself with the wind blowing every day, driving me nuts. But hey, you know, we're coffee or tea buddies or something, like, you know, like, wouldn't you want to go on this adventure with me? And we're friends or something like that. And then so they went out together. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of women doing things as a kind of a even small collective?
Yeah. So a few kind of cool things happened with some of those groups of women is you had to build a habitable residence on your quarter section, but they would build their little houses like feet away from each other, right? So they had a next door neighbor, right? Because they'd come with their friends. So they would cluster their houses in the corners or on the lines so that they could actually live in a little community together, is one of the things that they did. Sometimes they'd actually build one structure, put a bed on each side of it, right? Build it over the line so that everybody slept on their own side, but they could share a house, right? So you saw a lot of kind of communal stuff happen with those women.
Interesting.
The other thing you saw with a lot of, there'd be a lot of, right, girls just finished high school, they decided to go out and adventure. They would often get their title and immediately sell the land. They would move back home, get married, have a whole life. And then they write, you know, these stories later in life reflecting on this, like, well, 5-year adventure that I had going out and homesteading. But it was not, for some of those women, it was never meant to be permanent, right? It was an adventure that they did with their friends. They kind of got that independence out of their system, return home and lead otherwise kind of expected lives that we might expect them to have.
That's as good as it gets, I think, you know, I mean, unless you have some other plans for your life, you know, the idea that you say, okay, well, maybe this is not what I want when I'm 85. I don't want to be on the prairie by myself. But at 18, not so bad. You know, it's like I could go out there and have some fun. And you're on the prairie, you know, it's like, you know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, you know, so
Right.
all kinds of possibilities.
Yep.
But again, you know, like I'm always impressed with the kind of thing that happens to a woman who, how that adventure changes her, you know, versus the woman who did not have that adventure. I mean, you could make that statement about men or anybody else. You know, if you're a woman, you're expected less, quote, to have an adventure. But if you are the kind of woman who would say, I can do this, that's a different kind of woman, because otherwise more women would be doing that. Okay, so now this woman goes out, has this adventure, and she comes back, you know, she's got to be even more a different kind of woman. So I'm just thinking, again, how do this Homestead Act creates opportunities for women to actualize something that they are. They become something different because of that actualization. And now they come back to that society, which wasn't ready for them anyway. I'm just wondering, how does that impact, you know, the rest of society?
I mean, it's fun to read sort of stories and biographies of these types of women, because sometimes you'll read a story of, like, my grandma, shortly before she died, told me about this amazing adventure she had, but I always thought of her as just like a perfectly normal grandma or a perfectly normal mom. So sometimes I think they came home and just didn't really change them much. But you often, though, will see, as you read about leaders in the suffrage movement, there's definitely an overlap of women who went out and had this like period of independence, got federal government gave them land, they come home, right, and they can't vote. And then I guess it's kind of unsurprising to me that a fair number of these women, after they homestead, are kind of like, well, they're suffragists, right? Suddenly they think that maybe I should have a bigger say in government. And I guess, Lawrence, for the reasons you said, it doesn't surprise me that there's some overlap there, although it's certainly, is it cause and effect, right? It might just be the same type of woman was prone to both of those, or it might be that those years of independence kind of changed how some women thought about their lives.
Yeah, it seems to me it would be both, you know, at least in the sense that, you know, at least in my experience, I can think about something a lot, and I do probably more than I should sometimes. But what really changes things is when I go and practice the thing that I was thinking about. You know, if I go and actualize the thing, even if it's just a little bit, suddenly that thing that I was thinking about becomes more real, and it becomes me. It's not just some fanciful idea. And I can feel myself changing. I can feel myself, you know, having a different, a point of view that's actually me, as opposed to something that's in my head, but just resting in that cognitive space. You know, does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think I know we're short on time, but I will say this is I think one of the themes that comes out when you read a lot of the diaries of women, whether they homestead with husbands or alone, is that they hated the prairie when they came here. And over time, they come to love it, right? Some of them leave, but a lot of them stay and they become permanent community members. And they are some of the earliest elected officials in the country, come from these Western states of women who homesteaded, right? They're already exercising their rights. They decide to run for office and they do all of these cool things. So it's certainly not that not all of them left, but a lot of them stayed and really influenced the way that our Western communities formed.
And I think that there's something to tack on to what you just said, is not only did they run for office, but many of them won.
Yes.
They actually won. And they were still outnumbered by men. So that means clearly lots of men valued them for more than having babies, you know? So that's the thing, I think, that at least it has the opportunity to see that. Now the question, and where I find real value in your work, is how do we make that more of the American story? How do we get that story into our cognitive and our sense of who we are, in terms of, okay, here are women given an opportunity, they rose to the occasion, and it gives us a glimpse of what we're missing by writing them out, you know, but it's not like we're giving them some kind of gift of quote equality. We need them, you know, they're valuable members of our society. It's like only driving on two wheels of your car, you know, it's like, well, you know, you probably could use those other two wheels, you know. And so I'm very happy to have had this time to spend with you, Hannah. And I hope people will go get your book and also reflect on the kind of things that we've been talking about.
Thank you so much for having me. I really have appreciated the conversation.
Well, everybody, this is it. We'll see you next week on a brand new show. I'll give you a second. If you haven't gone into the chat, you can go down on the right-hand side in the chat. There's 3 little buttons. If you click on that, you can copy whatever's in the chat, and someplace in there will be the links and stuff that we'll put up, and you can use those. So until next week, same time, same station, good night, or good morning, or good afternoon.